All right, here we go. So, during this discussion, I'll go over the assignment and discuss what you need to do in each of the parts. And at the end, I'll be taking questions. Now, one thing I would like to say about this assignment is that unlike like some assignments in this course, this assignment looks more difficult than it actually is. And once you understand what exactly you're supposed to do, you'll be able to understand that it's not as difficult as it looks at first sight. So with that being said, I'll also be using the discussion notes here on the left to type things. So in case you're not able to hear me well or didn't understand something, refer to discussion notes on the left. This is especially for those of you who don't have good headphones or are not able to hear, crank up the volume well. Okay, so I'll be typing on the discussion notes in the left as well for those of you who can't hear me well. All right, so let's begin. So in this assignment, I hope most of you, if not all, have seen the assignment introduction video by Professor Packard, and I'll be mostly referring to that in this discussion because we are going to essentially implement the flowchart given in the last page, the mastermind flowchart in the mastermind info PDF. Okay, so I'll be going over each of the parts and telling you what exactly you're expected to do, and use the flowchart as a reference there. Okay. So parts A and B, you don't have to turn anything for those parts. All you have to do is read what's given, and I would highly recommend that you experiment with each of the functions given in parts A and B. Obtain guess from user P, create response P, find consistent codes P, auto guess P, as well as with the three versions of Mastermind, Mastermind V1P, Mastermind V2P, and Mastermind V3P. I would recommend that you experiment by passing different kinds of input to it and see how it behaves because you'll be implementing these functions yourself in this assignment. So you want to mimic the behavior of these reference implementations as closely as possible. So it's important for you to just play around with them a bit and figure out what they are doing for different kinds of input. And that's what you're expected to do in your own implementations as well. All right. So the first real thing that you have to turn in starts in part C, which asks you to write your own mastermind version 1 of the game. So what I'll be doing is again, as I mentioned before, referring to the flow chart, and you'll basically have to implement the flow chart, the different blocks in the flow chart in your code. So I'll be going over what you need to do exactly in this one. So to implement the mastermind V1, the pseudocode is given the flowchart. So first you have to generate a code, then query the user for guess, check if the guess is valid. If not, query again. If it is valid, then compute response from the code and the guess. Then increment the guess counter, display the game stats, and check whether the game is over. If not, go back and query the user for a guess again. And if it is over, then you display a congrats message or something. So that's essentially what you have to do. So we're going to start and work our way through the flowchart block by block and see what needs to be done. Okay. So the first thing that you need to do is generate code. And as is mentioned in the PDF for the homework, you can use the function randi. So randi 6, 1, 4 will generate a 1 by 4 array of integers from 1 to 6, and that you can use to generate your secret code, which the user has to guess. So that part is easy. The next thing you have to do is if you look at the flowchart, the structure of the flowchart itself indicates that you have to implement some kind of a loop. So the loop begins at querying the user for guess and checking valid if it's a valid guess, and then computing response, incrementing guess counter, displaying game stats, game over. So I'm sorry, I actually forgot to type as I promised I would. So generate code, just to recapitulate, you can do something like randi 6, 1, 4. Okay. All right. Can everyone see what I'm typing here? Can everyone see it? It's at the top of the discussion notes. Oh, you want me to type at the bottom? Okay. Uh, Sorry. I keep forgetting that the top is where problems happen. So here we go. All right. Can everyone see that? Okay. Is this good for everyone? So I'm typing at the bottom of the discussion notes what I'm saying. So the first block, generate code, just use rand I 616,1,4 and store it in the variable code. And that is the secret code that the user has to guess. The next few statements, the next blocks, query user for guess, valid guess, computing response, and all those other things until game over is in a loop, as the structure of the flowchart suggests. So we have to write some kind of a loop here. So what kind of a loop will it be? Will it be a while loop or a for loop? Clearly, in this case, since well, actually, it will be a while loop because we don't know in advance how many guesses the user will need to guess the correct answer. Okay, so when you're not sure about how many times the loop is to be executed, you generally use a while loop. So in this case, it would be more robust and more efficient and better to use a while loop to implement the blocks in that loop. All right, does that make sense? So while loop. Okay. Now, before we enter the while loop, we need to initialize a bunch of variables. Now, what are those variables? The variables you need to initialize are basically guess num. So, initialize before we enter the while loop. Here we go. So, initialize a bunch of variables like guess num. So, guess num say equal to 0. So what will this be used for? This is used for counting the number of guesses that the user has already input. And we want to exit the while loop when guess num becomes equal to 10. Okay, so you want to, this is one of the conditions you're going to use in the while loop. Okay, so here you'll have some conditions. Okay, one of them will involve guess num. And you have to check whether guess num is less than 10. The other variable you want to initialize is the matrices all guesses and all responses. Okay, so what these matrices are doing, they're basically, these arrays are storing all the guesses that the user made and all the responses for each of those guesses. And this is one of the outputs required in the mastermind v1, so you need to store that as well. You can initialize that by using the command zeros of an appropriate size. Okay, and the last thing you want to store is initialize is this this variable that checks whether the game is over, whether it was successful or not. So SF. So you want to keep executing the while loop until the user has guessed the correct code, right? So you want to initialize it to false first. Okay. So now when you enter the while loop, you'll say that while guess num is less than 10. So while number of guesses is less than 10 and the the game is not over yet, which you can check by this SF. Okay, all these statements will come inside the while loop. Okay, does that make sense to everyone? So all the statements where we query the user for input and check whether it's valid guess and compute response and all those things will come inside this while loop. So before entering the while loop, it's important to initialize these variables because these variables will control when the while loop is to be executed. So moving on, the next thing, so in the while loop, the first thing you want to do is increment your guess counter. Okay, so increment guess counter and then ask the user for input. So here you can use the pre-built, the given MATLAB. So I'll take the questions at the end, Jay. So let me just continue the discussion now since I'm explaining the flowchart, and I'll take all the questions at the end. Just hold on to your question. So what you want to do is ask the user for input, and for that you can use this function called the given function called obtain guess from user p. Okay. Now this function requires that you supply it an integer argument, which is the guess number. And that is why we need to first increment the guess counter. And then you can supply it over here. So this is guess number. Okay. So that's how you can get the input from the user. And once you get it, then you have to store it in the all guesses matrix. So you need to store the guess you obtained in the array all guesses. Okay. The next step you want to do, looking at the flow chart, is you have to compute the response. So the guess, the opt-in guess from user P already checks for you if it's a valid guess or not. Okay. So that step is already taken care of in this inbuilt function. So you don't have to do that. So once you obtain the guess, you store it in all guesses, which is guaranteed to be valid, and you have already incremented the guess counter. So now you want to compute the response. So for that, you can again use the given function called compute create response. So create response P will create the response for that particular guess. Okay. So and the next thing, as you did with the guess, you have to store the response. So you need to store the response generated by create response in all responses. Okay. So this is how you are going to update the this is important to update the game display because all the guesses and all the responses so far are stored in this. So now you need to display the game status. So you need to display what are the number of guesses the user has done so far, and how many, what are those guesses, and what are the responses to each of those guesses. So to display the game stats, display game stats, you can do a simple disp with a single input argument. Now, this input argument that you create, you must remember this takes only one input argument. So you must you must use some kind of concatenation to create the string you want to display, and you might find it useful to use the functions like num to string to convert these arrays, all guesses and all responses, into strings. So you need to use int to string or num to string and other functions to create like to create a display create the message to display the game stats. Okay. And once you do that, you want to check if the game is over yet. Okay. So how do you check that? So that is checked by looking at the response created by response function. Now the response created by response function has two outputs. The first one gives you the number of right color right place, so right numbers in the right place, and the second one gives you the right color wrong place, so the right numbers but in the wrong place. So you just need to check if the first number is 4. So if the first number is 4, that means all the numbers are in the right places, and so the game is over. So check if game is over. So you can do that very simply by just checking what the uh, first output variable of response is. So the response that you generated, if response 1 is equal to 4. Okay. Response 1 equal to 4 means all the 4 numbers are in the right color. So all the 4 numbers are right color, right place. And if that is true, then you just say, so if it is true, so if true, oops, then you just set your SF counter to true so that you don't want to implement the loop again and display some congratulatory message saying congratulations, whatever. Okay. So you can create this message similar to what is shown in the PDF, and that is so that is how you check if the game is over. And if it's not true, then what do you do? Well, you just like don't do anything. I mean, you just go back to a loop and query the user for a new input. So this is where you end the loop. Okay. So that's the basic implementation of how to implement the flowchart. The only other thing to add in this one would be to say that supposing the user guesses the right code in less than 10 guesses, then you might want to delete the extra entries in, so delete the extra rows in all guesses and all responses. Okay, in case you created them. So you can, so when you initialize all guesses and all responses, supposing you initialized it to zeros equal to the maximum number of guesses that you can make, then if the user has guessed it in less than the maximum number of guesses, then you want to delete the extra rows in all guesses and all responses. So you need to do that last cleanup step in the mastermind V1 program. So that's all that you have to do in part C. Okay, now let's move on to part D. So in part D, you're asked to write your own uh, version of uh, this function create response. Okay. Now, of the four functions that you have to code, create response, get user, obtain guess from user, and auto guess and find consistent codes, this is probably one of the easiest ones to code. Okay. So again, the flow chart, the algorithm for this one is described in the video, which I would recommend you take a look. And but in a sense, what you have to do here is two things. The first thing you want to do is the right, find the number of right color, right place. Okay. So I'm using the word color for numbers over here because the original example was with colors, so it's easier for me to say. I'm just using that analogy. Okay. So I'm gonna first find the right color in the right place. Now, how would one do that? So the inputs to this program are, so the inputs are your code and guess, right? So you know the code is, you know what the guess is, and you want to compare the code and guess and find which is right in the right place. So this is essentially the same as doing an array comparison. Okay, so you need to just check for check each element of the code with the corresponding element in guess and check if they're equal. So if they're equal, that means that that particular number is the right number and also in the right place. So you could do something like code equal to guess. Okay, that will just check which of the how many which of the numbers are in the right which of them are the right numbers and also in the right place. Okay, and then to find the total number of right numbers in the right place, you just need to count how many of these there are. Okay, so you could use so you could store this in some array and count the number of ones in that, or you could do it any other way you want. Okay, so this is the first thing you need to do. Then after you've found the right color in the right place, you need to remove those entries from your code and guess arrays, because for computing the right color wrong place, you don't need to consider them anymore. Okay, so the next thing you want to do is remove those entries from the code and guess. So you know how to remove entries from an array. You could just use the delete operator, which is this one. Okay, now we need to find the right color, find the number of entries in the guess which are the right color but wrong place. Okay, or right numbers but in the wrong place. So this can be done in a loop over here. So what you need to do is essentially, so let's say you want to store this in some variable, say r right color wrong place, rcwp. So initialize that variable to 0. Okay, and then you want to loop through the remaining entries of guess and see if it matches any entry in code. Okay, so that's how you can check if for the number of right color wrong place. So you just whatever, so you have deleted some entries from code and guess, the ones which are right in the right place and right color. So the remaining entries, you just take them one by one and try to match it with every entry in the code. So wherever it matches, so you could have here you could have something like a for loop. So for k equal to 1 to whatever, uh, you could say that compare. So you could say that if guess k, so the kth entry in the code, if it matches any entry of the code, so say code, then find like use find to get where it matches, or use find to get the first uh, entry, use find to get the matching entries, or the first matching entry, because you want to match it only once, first matching entry. And then if you find a match, so if match found, increment RCWP, the right color wrong place, okay, and delete that entry from code, so that the next time you try to match another entry of the guess from the code, you don't match it again. Okay, so this is similar to what you did for right color, right place, where you deleted those entries. So in the same way over here, you have to delete that entry, and that's all you have to do over here. Okay, and then you finally construct your response by just concatenating the right color, right place, and right color, wrong place variables. So RCRP and RCWP. See, okay, does this make sense to everyone? All right, so let's move on. So this is all you have to do in part D, and as I said, it's the logic of what you have to implement is fairly straightforward. Now the next thing what you have to do in this one is in part E is you're asked to write your own obtain guess from user. So this part of the assignment is very similar to what you did in to the CDL assignment. I think it was the last problem. So there you checked a, an array for the inputs and checked if it was real, numeric, all integers, and if the numbers are between 1 and 6. So this is exactly what you have to do in this one. Except here you need to, the error code over there was a bunch of numbers. Here your error code is replaced by messages that you need to display, appropriate messages to the user if their input is wrong. Okay, so so the way to implement this is, again, you need to have a loop here. So what kind of loop will we use here? Again, since we don't know how many times the user will try like input before inputting a valid entry, you'll have to use a while loop over here. Okay, so we need a while loop. Now this loop has to run until the user inputs a valid entry, right? So you need some way to check that, and so for that you need to create a variable and initialize it, say say validity, okay, and initialize it to say false. Okay, so while validity of the input is, so while not validity, okay, so while the input is not valid, you keep executing this while loop until the user inputs a valid input. Okay, now what do you have to do in the while loop over here? So the first thing you need to do is try uh, taking the input from the user. So you can implement a try catch block over. You can say try, say input some message over here, and try to get the input from the user. And if for some reason the user inputs some random thing which doesn't correspond to what you're expecting, then you can catch it in the catch block and say something like oh, invalid expression or something. Okay, so this is one of the this is one thing you have to do. So try catch, and you need an end for that. Okay. Okay, so you got an input from the user, and now you want to check if it's valid. Okay, so you have to check if user input is valid. Now here, one thing, so one way to do it would be to use a sub function. So you can use a sub function. You already studied the concept of sub function, so you can use a sub function to check the validity of this input and display appropriate messages to the user if the input is not valid. Okay, so let's say you define a local subfunction, say check validity or something. So what you want this function to do is you want it to give you two two outputs. You want to give you the output, say valid and message. Okay, so valid will say the function is called check validity. Okay, so check the validity of the guess. So this the first output argument valid basically is true or false depending on if the input is valid. Okay, and the other output variable message basically stores what is wrong the with the input if it is invalid. Okay, so this is what this subfunction does. It basically takes the input, user input, and checks if it's valid. If it's valid, it will set valid to true or true. If it's not valid, it will set to false. And the message will store what is wrong with the input if it is invalid. Okay. So now what you need to do in this particular while loop is just check if v flag is positive. So if valid, if it is true, then you just input that guess. So you just your output of this variable of this function guess. So I shouldn't use guess here. Maybe I'll call this as user input. So if the user input was valid, then your output for this particular function gets from user is basically whatever the user input. Okay, and if it is not valid, then you have to display the message that the subfunction gave you. Okay. The other thing, also in if it is valid, you don't want to keep asking the user for new input, right? So you also need to set the flag validity to true over here. So the next time the while loop checks this condition, it will evaluate to false, and you won't ask the user again for input. Okay. Now the only thing that is left to do to complete this function is to create this sub function. So sub function say check validity, okay, which takes the user input as it is and checks if it's valid. And this is where you implement the exact same thing that you implemented in the serial assignment. Namely, you first check if the input is double and real, then check if the input is a 1 by 4 array, and then check if all entries in the input are integers, and then check if all the entries are between 1 and 6. Okay, so all of these steps you've already implemented in your serial assignment, and that's exactly what you have to do over here. So you can use that same code that you used in that assignment over here. Okay, so and the output of this one say is v and message. So if either of these conditions is triggered, so if it is not input or real, then you set v equal to false. So v equal to false and an appropriate message. Okay, and the same thing you have to do for each of these. So if either of these conditions is not met, you set v equal to false and set the appropriate message. So in the first case, you'll say, oh, input is not real or double. In the second case, you'll say the input is not a 4 by 1 array. In the third case, you'll set message to the input are not all integers. And the fourth case, you'll say the input are not all between 1 and 6. So you need to set message appropriately depending on which error condition is satisfied. Okay, now all of these messages need not be mutually exclusive. So it can be that if the input is not double and real, you want to input all the messages. So one way to implement that would be to do the same thing as you did in error code, append the messages at the end. But in the error code, you were appending numerical numbers. So here you want to append string arrays. So one way to do that is to create this cell array. So something like mess equal to cell 0, 1. Okay. And then whenever any of these other conditions is triggered, you just append to this cell array. So set message appended to this cell array mess. Okay. So this will give the user exhaustive clue as to what exactly is wrong with his input, and he or she can input the right thing. Okay. So this is all you have to do for part E. Check get user from input. All right. Moving on to part F. Part F wants you to produce your own mastermind V3. Okay. So there's really nothing much to say over here because we have done most of the things that you need to implement for mastermind in part C. So all same as part C, except the only difference is that in part C you took the guess from the user. So you had the line saying guess guess from user. So here you have to replace that with the auto guesser. So you have to get the guess from this auto guesser AGH. So this is the function handle to the auto guesser, and you have to supply it with all guesses that have been done so far and all responses that has been obtained so far. Okay, so since you want to supply it with all the guesses that have been done so far, you could give it all the rows from 1 to guess num and all columns, and the corresponding responses by 1 to guess num comma columns. Okay, so this is the only difference. Everything else remains exactly the same. So there's not much to add in this one. Moving on to part G. Part G asks you to produce your own autoguess. Again, this is one of the simpler codes to implement, partly because you're going to use the given supplied function find consistent codes P. So all you have to do is call that function find. So, find consistent codes P, right, with the guess array. So what all you have guessed so far, and the response array. Okay, and the code find consistent P will find all possible all possible secret codes that are consistent with all the entries in guess array and response array. So you can store this in, say, some array C, and then this will store all the possible codes that the computer might have generated, which are consistent with all the guesses and responses generated so far. And then you just select a random row from that and use that out your output. So select a random row from say RIDX from C. So the random row from C will basically take a random consistent code and use that as a guess. So select a random row from C. You can use any of the rand functions that you want and use that as the output. So you could say something like output y is equal to, so y is equal to C, the random row. Okay, so that's all that needs to be done in this part, nothing more than that. All right, and now coming to part H, which is the most interesting and interesting of all, the last function, find consistent codes P. So this is the part that you'll have to do a little bit of thinking about. Okay, so what we want to do in this part is we want to find all the possible codes that the computer might have generated, which are consistent with the given with all the guesses and the corresponding responses to those. Okay, so supposing you've played the game a few number of times, say 5 number of times, you've had 5 guesses and 5 responses. This function will basically tell you all possible codes that would have generated the same responses for those same 5 guesses. Okay, so this is what this function does. So the first thing you want to do in this function is determine all possible codes. Okay, and you can, one way to do that is use the code snippet given in the PDF. So the code snippet is generates a 4 by, so with B and D, you can read what the code snippet does and see what the pattern is doing. So you can change those numbers and create all the possible codes using that kind of snippet. Okay, you have to just change some numbers there. Now, once you determine all the possible codes, what do you want, how do you decide what are the consistent codes? So what you do is you basically take each code from all the possible codes, compare the response using create response, compare the response you would get if you had guessed the given guess, and compare the response you get with the response that is already given. So if the response is matched, then that is a possible code. If it's not, then it's not a possible code. It's inconsistent. So that's the basic idea. So again, here we need some sort of a loop to loop through the possible codes, right? So let's call the matrix of possible code after the PDF, say pos code. Okay. So now what we want to do is check if check what response each guess in the all guesses array generates. So here you could use create response to check the response and compare to the corresponding response in all responses array. Okay, so if the two match, so if they match, then that code is a possible, is a consistent code, consistent with the given guesses and responses. If not, it's not consistent. Okay, so this is what you have to do. So as I mentioned before, you need some kind of a loop here, and the loop to be used, since we know how many iterations there are, we'll use a for loop. So you'll have some variable, say for k equal to 1 to whatever. Okay, and then you take each guess in the guess matrix. Okay, so supposing the guess matrix is all guesses. Okay, so you take each guess that is a kth row. Okay, and then take the response for that guess. So response, which is all responses k, and then I'm doing this funny thing that says you can type only so many characters. Maybe I need to delete something from the top. So I'm going to delete a few things here, make some more space. Okay. So response, all responses, and now you want to check whether the response generated by that guess for each of the codes would be the same as what the response you got. Okay, so here you can use another for loop, say for I equal to 1 to say number of rows in pos codes, number of possible codes, right? And then you just check. So if uh, create response, so if supposing that was a possible code, okay, so pos code I comma colon, if that's the secret code and you guessed it as this guess, then you'll get some response. So check if that is equal to the response that you got for that code from the program. If it is, then that means that's a possible code, right? So that's a consistent code, so you don't do anything with it. But if not, so if this is, so if this does not match, okay, So remember, I'm writing in pseudocode. This is not exactly what you have to type. You can implement in different ways, but this is the basic idea. So if it does not match, then you delete that row from the list of possible codes. So you just delete that row saying that. Okay, so that's how you keep reducing the number of possible consistent codes. Uh, and finally, what you're left with is the set of all codes that are consistent with the given all guesses and all responses matrix. Okay, so as I said, once you understand what you need to do in this assignment, it shouldn't look that challenging to you. And I hope I've been able to convey that to you in this discussion. So that's all I have to say in this discussion. I'll end this recording now.